Well, I thank you for being here, sitting in a dingy room when it's bright and sunny outside, and you could be across the street at the public garden. But I have a talk, and I'm going to do it sociological style. I'm going to talk for about 45, maybe 50 minutes to get through my talk. The title, as it says, is Ethnography as a Craft. I was asked in Paul's nice email that invited me to this gathering to provide some insight, wisdom, expertise, practicalities, challenges, and potentially new forms of ethnography. This is a smart and heady event. I'm honored and flattered to be here and to be amongst what I take to be a gathering of fellow qualitative researchers. So one of your clan is speaking. I follow in the bright shadows of Jeannie Bartunek, Henry Mintzberg, Denny Joya, so something fresh and substantial, at least intendedly, is in order. And I've cobbled together a partial confession, as they all are, they're partial, out of the two penny nails of past papers, books, talks, personal experience. Basically, I'm acting as sort of a literary strumpet to teach myself. On a meager subject it may be, but I have the requisite expertise. What I have to offer is a series of observations on my take on ethnography as today and how it developed over my career. It's an enlarging, becoming booming scholarly endeavor, long escaped from its disciplinary origins in anthropology and sociology. And the field has many adherents around the globe that subscribe to a particular form of ethnography, perspectives and practices that may differ in various ways from my own. It's carved out a recognizable niche in many domains. There's social work, public policy, market research, management studies, criminology, education, planning, folklore, media studies, design, primatology. I was asked to give a talk recently at the musicology department at Harvard. You go figure. Ethnography is every place these days, it seems. Such is the current attraction and spread of the field. And as I've said elsewhere, I think that this diversity is by and large invigorating and healthy, and I have no hidden agenda to critique or restrict these other perspectives. Nor do I aspire to offer up a proverbial best practice, for I don't think there is one. I can really only speak from my own point of view that worked out over the years in the plein air of the field and at the writing desk. My remarks necessarily rest on areas that I've spent most of my career exploring, namely ethnography and culture, with a distinctly small c these days. Ethnography concerns the study and representation of culture as it plays out in the problems, strategic and otherwise, faced by a given group of people. There are two sides to the coin. On one side entails the study of culture, which usually involves fieldwork, which I take to be the personal and immersive involvement of the researcher for a sustained period of time into the lives of others. The other side of the coin is representation. Typically in writing of what was absorbed and learned through such fieldwork. This is text work. It's a practice some claim to be the most humanistic of the sciences and the most scientific of the humanities. That's a somewhat remarkable, if blurry, convergence of approaches and standards. Broadly speaking, it's a storytelling institution with a good deal of scholarly legitimacy, whose works are commissioned, approved, published by the leading scholarly institutions of the day. It carries an NSF stamp of approval, usually these days an IRB license to commit ethnography. It claims a sort of documentary status by the fact that somebody actually goes out beyond the ivory towers of comfort, and with qualifications, of course, to live with and live like those who are studied. Yet to establish its scholarly status, ethnography is subjected to a double ordeal. Its documentary status must pass a test of epistemological veracity, dictated by the research community to which it wishes to contribute, while its storytelling status must undergo a trial of aesthetic appeal that is typical of the arts and humanities. Much admired, high-quality ethnographies bring up high scores on both of these dimensions. My career began properly in 1969, a year in the field with the Seattle Police Department. Study of street policing served as my doctoral dissertation, and it's often assumed that ethnographers choose field sites like choosing mates for life. Some of them do. Even when it's not true, as I suspect is most often the case, site switching rarely breaks the reader's association with the ethnographer with his first tribe, or her first tribe, usually the most admired of the work. Garrett's tied forever to the Balinese, just as Bill White's forever bound to the street corners of Boston. It turned out in my case, this lasting cyclical environment with the police would mark my work with the police, but I didn't plan it that way. As an aside, it's sobering to realize that few ethnographers maintain the intensity of the research activity after they've completed a dissertation. It's, to say the least, a continuous challenge to find the energy, time, resources, commitment necessary to engage in labor-intensive work and still be a member of a reasonably good standing in what is perhaps the most institutionally anchored workplace in the world, the modern university. The ever-increasing trials and tribulations of the modern university make it difficult, including the push for prodigious research output in the early stages of one's career, obligatory demands of teaching and the face work that it generates, despair and shrinking research funds, unrelenting department administrative duties, along with the rise of a measurement-oriented audit culture that has come to typify many schools and departments. These are hardly comparable with the and compatible with the unbearable slowness of ethnography. But such future contingencies were not much on my mind when I escaped from graduate school. I joined MIT. Astonishingly and unexpectedly, I've been there ever since. A few sabbatical years as a visiting professor of various places, and some splendid research leaves there, here, there, and everywhere. Aside from numerous visits and revisits to Seattle over a 25-year period, I've worked with coppers and detectives from Scotland Yard. I've written also of fishermen in the Northeast Atlantic and ride operators at Disneyland, here, there, and everywhere. I've crossed more than a few geographic organizational boundaries, and like many ethnographers, crossed many theoretical boundaries as well, from positivism to postmodernism, shamelessly borrowing ideas and analytic ideas wherever I could find them, and using them wherever they seem to fit. Style that is both eclectic and pragmatic to the core. For all these years, I've defined myself as a field worker who is interested in various lines of work, an ethnographer with a circumspect and qualified realist bent, though I've played some with confessional impressionist forms. This is, to be sure, an inflated, self-serving, rather vague label, but the label is a good part of my scholarly identity, my engulfed self, my vocation, my calling. Moreover, the meaning of this identity has developed and deepened over the years, largely on the grounds of what I wrote and what I published. When you start publishing, it's probably impossible to see where it's going to lead. What will you produce after 5 years, after 10 years, after 20 years, or gulp, after 50 years? At first, there's the thrill of seeing your name in print, in this case my name and my laborious yet under-edited words, finally being read and with a little luck appreciated and cited by others. I started out publishing anywhere and everywhere I could. I say the work was under-edited because I was publishing all over the scholarly and not so scholarly map. I edited several books on policing and organizational careers. I published articles in research annuals, indoor stopping social science handbooks, contributed invited essays to various collections of readings, on theoretically driven topics. I wrote several pieces that appeared in obscure practitioner journals. I even wrote a quirky how-to primer a short book entitled The Process of Program Evaluation in 1973 for a public administration audience. Many of these publishing venues were at best lightly curated. It was a time, obviously, when there was less of a focus on what today we refer to with a degree of anxiety and dread as the esteemed A journals, thus allowed a wider range of writing forms. The method-obsessed, narrowing house styles for qualitative work in general, and ethnography in particular, had yet to be developed. It did, however, give me a rather wide liberty of expression. That was a terrific advantage because I could choose my topics on the basis of personal interest, find my scholarly voice without a lot of pressure from journal reviewers and tightly wound, focused, and discipline-defining editors. And luckily, I was at M.I.T, where the values and ethics are best expressed by the 6 Anglo-Saxon words, "Don't tell me what to do." More importantly, perhaps, but largely in the background, there was then, as now, no overly specialized lexicon or privileged conceptual apparatus associated with ethnography, other than an intense focus on the empiric. There are disciplinary and subdisciplinary specialties and preferences, to be sure, but they range widely and are rather fuzzy and loose. The relative freedom from formula or recipe gives an oh-so-slight literary air to ethnography, leaving it open to a relatively stylized, improvised, situated form of social research. True, I've had some experience with the formulaic, peevish, and as Chick Perot, memorable phrase, asphalting journals. These are the high church journals of the day, the aforementioned A journals, in which one is expected to make a contribution to the field, as if a contribution is easy to make, like giving contribution to the local NPR station, Salvation Army, Oxfam. And I've published some in ASQ following the dictates of ferocious, take-no-prisoner House editor Linda Johansson. I published some in Org Science, several academy journals. Stepping down a little, I've managed articles in the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, Sociology of Work and Occupations, and a couple in Human Organization and the Anthropology Journal. In short, I've spent time in the journal submission trenches and been through the tedious, time-consuming, irksome, exasperating, endless R&R rituals of an established academic field. Ergo, a contribution was apparently made, but in the early days at least, it's impossible to know your work, the quality of it, your relationship to it, what you want to make of it, what you want to say. All these change over time. And in terms of measured sorrow, I'm not so sure that I really know the range and meaning of my work even now, a matter I'll elaborate on later. Yet if there's an arc in terms of how I relate to my work at different stages in my career, it's of the following sort. In the early stages, I felt I was close to finding a grip. I was getting on matters of my concern, be they gathering up the ethnographic particulars or eliciting and tweaking the analytic notions that I was using to pack up this representational material on socialization, on culture, on careers, on cops. This was a delusion. There was, and always be, far more to learn, to understand, to take in, to discover. And while my studies have beginnings, clear beginnings, they now seem to have no endings. The idea that the scholarly record ends at the moment of publication is fundamentally wrong. There is always more to say. Even the demise of the field worker, God help us, doesn't conclude the enterprise, given the inevitability of restudies, usually conducted by younger ethnographers out to check on their elders, and add a new wrinkle or two to the existing ethnographic and historical base. I take this to be a rather common feature, not a bug. It's associated with many research careers and not just ethnographic ones. As we read more, experience more, our confident hold on what we study and know for certain lessons, our interests broaden, our assumptions and conceits are challenged, our positions in the world change. We find that things are far more complicated and less certain than our early portraits or models would suggest. I now despair of ever getting things down pat, without doubt or without hesitation. As ethnographers, we produce a partial, fallible, and rather conjectural account of a particular parcel of reality. We can't claim that what we know is an unimpeachable truth. The cosmic secrets of the world are always slippery, foggy, just out of reach, ephemeral, playful, ever-changing, shifty. Instead, what we think we know is a set of arguments about the meaning and significance of what we've seen, heard, and experienced in the field. All social settings are multidimensional. They're rich and complex, quite able to support a range of interpretations depending upon the researcher's interests. In this regard, I'm reminded again of a wry quote from Marshall Salins in anthropology, who said there are two certainties associated with an academic career. One is that in the end, we'll all be wrong. The second is, in the end, we'll all be dead. So a good academic career depends upon the second truth preceding the first truth. True, too, as your career unfolds, and this one in particular, shifts in interests occur. Some pragmatic, paradigmatic, topical, theoretical, methodological. Some grow, some decline. What recognition I receive these days is tied, unsurprisingly, to my relatively recent work. My older work that was reasonably well cited at the time has fallen off the field's radar. The invitations I receive these days are mostly related to ethnographic representation and practice, asking me to review a manuscript, blurb a new book, be a discussant on a panel, deliver a paper, give a talk, a speech act that includes the very words you're hearing right now. These are all activities, and by no means ones that are unpleasant, that I've done a good deal of in recent years, but they differ rather significantly and substantially from this in the late show of my career from what I was doing earlier. In a sketchy, uneven, abbreviated form, it's an ethnographic career unfolding. Recognizable phases and stages, perhaps, but none well planned. A career formed more or less organically, exploring research opportunities that fortuitously appeared and made sense of, largely in retrospect, by this semi-coherent narrative that I've hastily whipped up here. But what of the work itself? What do I make of ethnography as a social practice, recognizing that there's considerable wingspan in the kinds of work that claims the mantle of ethnography? Much of the work I admire and respect, even though it departs in various ways from my own version of canonical ethnographic practice. My view of ethnography is that it is a logic, it's a stance, if you will, rather than a given method or a particular type of study. It names an epistemology, a way of knowing, a kind of knowledge that results, and it's anything but a recipe. It involves fieldwork, headwork, text work, results typically in a written representation of the cultural understandings held by others, meanings about life, about work, about past, imagined future, about disputes, problems encountered, both mundane and acute. They're tied closely to a specific context, and these days usually put forth by ethnographers in a text far more provisional and partial than in the past. This tentativeness is a result, I think, of the deep suspicion of all systems and grand narratives expressed over the past 25 or so years by the serious, deconstructive, feminist, reflexive, postmodern critiques of realism. So that even the most realist of ethnographers among us, unless they're struck down by a reader's block, has probably engaged with and drawn cautionary lessons from this literature. This is not to say that there is nothing beyond interpretation, or that every form of knowledge is but an extension of power, but it is to suggest that we must treat representational or truth claims now rather gingerly. As a process, ethnography is dynamic, recursive, and the encounter with the foreign is the very essence of ethnography. It involves observation, conversation, and participation used in sundry permutations with different degrees of formality. We spend, for instance, a few days in the field, meander about the scene, hang out, watch what people do, talk to people from different than ourselves who hold ideas in various ways that depart, often spectacularly, from our own. We learn what we can, we alter the questions we ask and the way we ask them, spend a few more days in the field, talk to more people, and on and on and on it goes. Those who revere standardization kind of break out in hives when ethnographers hold forth about their craft. Poking and prying with a purpose, and where it stops, nobody knows, at least at the outset. Fieldwork generates both insider accounts for cultural members for what's going on and first-hand observations on the scene. The balance between the two, or lack thereof, leads either to a quotation-driven ethnography based primarily on accounts derived largely from conversation and interviews, or a context-driven ethnography based primarily on events and participant observation. Two forms of data are not equivalent, and I consider the latter, the eye-witnessing, to be something of the gold standard. Accounts are indeed valuable in that they interest is on the actor's outlook and the way they make sense of themselves and their surroundings. They are, of course, rather easier to gather, require less commitment and time on the part of all those in the field, and provide more control to insiders in terms of what the field worker can learn. But in a phrase, they tell us only what people say, not do. And the difference between the two can be and often is substantial. More generally, ethnography is improvisational, not procedural. It's path-dependent because we learn more about the activity, subjectivity, intentionality of those we encounter in the field well after our work has begun. And the longer we are at it, the more we learn and the more we need to learn. Our knowledge accumulates and changes over time as we come closer to understanding the problems and perspectives, the situated practices and points of view of people from whom we are learning. Knowledge accumulates in part because surprise, the holy grail of ethnography, is inevitable, taken seriously. When people do or say what we least expect, explanations are called for. It is the imaginative reaction to surprise that fuels ethnography, such that the early days in the field are often the most exciting, perhaps the most creative. Periods of study since the learning curve for the ethnographer is rapidly accelerating. Yet, as I've discovered in all my work, cultural learning curves rarely flatline, in part because culture itself is hardly static. There's always more to learn. Surprise is just around the bend. Exit is largely arbitrary, leaving and little to do with theoretical or empirical saturation. One becomes an ethnographer by going out and doing it, coming back to write it all up. It's both a rite of passage of the trade and a strongly held occupational norm. The central idea is to develop a narrative about what it's like to be somebody else. It requires removal from your usual routines, familiar haunts, everyday social relationships, such that the world one is studying becomes home, if only temporarily, in which survival, getting in, staying in, and being in, is itself premised on coming to see the world as do others who must live in it. Certainly not with great subtlety at first, but deepening with time and exposure. The idea is to get into a position where you can experience some of the same events, the same rituals, routines, achievements, troubles of those you are learning from. To be in a situation where you can feel the pressures that they feel, decipher their interests, their intentions, recognize their problems, and come to understand the contingencies they face. Put bluntly, this often means taking the same kind of shit that they take. Nothing much can prepare you for this kind of intensive fieldwork. If you can't figure out how to get close to the community, the organization, the neighborhood, the gang, or any odd group you want to study, if you can't figure out what to ask the proverbial natives, if you can't figure out how to build a certain type of rapport with often recalcitrant, suspicious others, then it's time to think about a pleasant career in economic sociology. Or experimental social psychology, where the so-called data are unlikely to be quite so cagey, to talk back, to question you, the questioner. On the textual side of the coin, ethnography means getting some distance from the field. It seems an open secret among those who have done lengthy away-from-home fieldwork that coming back is as difficult and maybe perhaps tougher than going out. In retrospect, I understand this state of affairs, for withdrawing from the field doesn't mean that one has finished the ethnography. Some might say not even begun the ethnography. They've only been to the field. What awaits them is endless time stretched out in front of them to write a thesis, a chapter, a book, get articles out in short to make the fabled contribution. Often overlooked is that exiting also makes one aware that a good deal of what was hidden or appeared as trivial while in the field is in fact critical to the work. In my case, certain things suddenly stood out, such as the skepticism and deep distrust that I've absorbed from street cops for the claims and justifications, excuses offered by those subjected to police attention, or the discomfort I experienced when exposed out of uniform in certain public places, or the fortifying camaraderie I felt in the company of certain officers who were no longer with me. These were not apparent to me at the time, although recognizing them later when I was out of the field and figuring out how they fit into my work was a gradual, long, drawn-out process. Briefly, leaving the field makes apparent the consequence of fieldwork upon the fieldworker, the ethnographer. For me, and perhaps others, this resembles something akin to the Stockholm Syndrome or the hostage mentality. It results when one begins to slowly and often unconsciously identify with their captors. While I was definitely free to leave at any time during my fieldwork with the police, say, I'd also identified, perhaps over-identified, with the street cops who are my teachers and had my back in the field. I'd become close to them as I could, as a way of staying in the field, but the problem on exiting was to get as far away from them as I could without leaving the planet. What is required, of course, is to recognize and shake off the insider's point of view, something akin to an outsider's perspective that doesn't naturalize the culture. Easier said than done. In this regard, my field notes were still a comfort, if not exactly a guide. Read long after their inscription, they were revealing on many fronts, but I discovered also I could recall from reading about the events that I described in my notes the feeling that those events generated, and many of the contextual details that at the time I didn't think important enough to write down. There's a good deal of angst made when field workers express on returning home being chock full of stories, but not knowing much about what to do with them. Certainly has been true for me. But as I sort through my memories, my materials, I look for now what I call my delicious ironies, my strange quirks, my VSTs, very special things, and begin writing about these features of the life to be inscribed. These are marked features that represent those peculiarities, those curiosities, those paradoxes, surprises that one inevitably brings back with them from the field. To me, it's a list of things that had most puzzled and perplexed me, and I felt instinctively that they cried out for analysis. VSTs don't make a thesis or a book very often, or even an article, but for me, they're a way to start writing. Coming back from a stay with the police and trying to sort out, for example, how the asshole label was attributed to some and not others, was mind-boggling. I'd ask why this guy now sitting handcuffed in the back of the patrol car is an asshole, and be told by my partner it's because he's a jerk-off, doesn't know what he's doing, doesn't know what the hell he's doing. When I would press my partner for why he doesn't know what he's doing, I was told it's because he's an asshole. I could take so much of this circular reasoning in the field before I began to feel my head would explode. It's a little like asking cultural members why they do what they do, getting back a blank stare, incomprehension, or be told simply it's just the way we do things. About as useful as asking a plumber why they use a wrench. At any rate, by wrestling with these VSTs, I've come to the view that whatever narrative, interpretation, or argument I've been able to formulate is done a posteriori, in the nature of an afterthought, It emerges for me primarily, although not exclusively, through the composition process taking place out of the field. It's a process by which I try to work through and propose a suggestively contextual, rather than authoritatively causal, explanation that at least aspires to be ineluctable, such that a careful reader cannot casually dismiss my interpretation. And this, I think, is craft work. How does all this stumbling around, rambling back and forth, goes on into the craft? How does it come together in the end? How is it that a coherent research narrative can be fashioned, put forth in a persuasive way? It can't be purely a deductive procedure, using observation and interview to test prior theory. That would fail to capture the Columbian or exploratory spirit of ethnography. Nor can it be purely an inductive process, for one cannot fruitfully amass more and more data, or VSTs, without guiding ideas to inform a useful engagement with the particular surfaced. Yet many students seem to operate this way, and you're eventually confronted with piles of unanalyzed interview transcripts, heaps of enumerated data, and hundreds, nay thousands of pages of field notes. And many introductory texts grossly misrepresent the real work of analysis, confounding it with the mechanical tasks of searching, counting, comparing, coding, classifying, a process akin to pulling a rabbit out of a hat by generating, for instance, raw or first-level codes, moving on to second-level codes, moving on to third-level codes, fourth-level codes, fifth-level codes, that purportedly aggregate and subsume earlier codes. To my mind, the framework that helps organize the mass of field data without doing it harm comes mostly from trial and error, happenstance, good fortune. It takes a long time to be formulated, years perhaps. But it comes largely from abductive reasoning, pragmatic philosophy of Charles Peirce, an analytic style that asks the researcher, when confronted with a series of observations, to speculate continually on what underlying state of affairs might give rise to the observed phenomenon. This seems to me to be precisely what creative field researchers do, and a particularly apt way to characterize the analytic work of ethnography without smashing it into a formula. It's a continual cycling of observations and ideas until a satisfying, though forever in progress, correspondence is found. I've used at various times all these strategies in coming to terms with my field material, especially my VSTs. I haven't made descriptive or analytic leaps, though, in splendid isolation, sealed off in my writing nook. I've written about textual practices at some length, but there remains a rather common and altogether misleading assumption that writing is largely a solo act, the writer who writes alone. Suppressed by this image are the contextual and social aspects of writing that a short list would include. Matters such as the substantive and thematic choices we make, the analytic guides we follow, our reading of other writers, discussing our ideas in content and style and method and theory, both in passing and seriously with, say, students and colleagues. The vital roles played by others who read our drafts, polished or unpolished, including fierce critics, friends, foes, relatives, daunting thesis advisors, both past and present. And through this highly social process, we come to write in a language, tone, grammar, voice, genre, figures of speech on topics that literally encode collectivity. We place our field materials in frameworks that seem to emerge out of an ongoing series of endless negotiation processes between ourselves and those others, including reviewers, editors, and kindred spirits, both real and imagined, whom we grant the authority to help shape our work. We are perhaps remiss in acknowledging such sources, so numerous are they, but surely we do not write alone. If an unwritten ethnography is no ethnography at all, so too is an unread one. This emphasis on the social context of text works brings to light certain alterations or innovations in ethnographic telltale. Among them, and hinted at earlier, the burden of ethnography to represent culture has become heavier, messier, and less easily located in time and space. This faith in ethnographic holism, always something of an ethnographic fiction, akin to Newton's frictionless space, has continued to retreat along with all those quaint claims of writers to have captured the spirit of a people, the ethos of a university, or the culture of a nation or organization. While I think the trope of holism remains strong and dangerously seductive as a kind of literary suction pump or a rhetorical imperative, I thought necessary to give a study a sense of closure, but it seems to me that there's a lot more open-endedness to ethnography these days. Another shift stems from the epistemological hypochondria that Clifford Geertz famously suggested in 1988 attaches itself to ethnography. It seems to have spread widely, deeply through most ethnographic research communities, and most of us would now agree that all ethnographies owe a good deal of their persuasive power and their wonder to contingent social, historical, institutional forms. No meta-argument, navel-gazing, or reflexivity can effectively question that contingency. Yet, those hypochondriacs like me that soldier on, rather than taken to bed, have mostly come to recognize that this sublime contingency matters little when it comes to putting ink to paper, because any single ethnography must still make its points by the same means that were available before the contingency was recognized. The means are, by and large, the old ones. They include the hard work of putting forth evidence, providing interpretations, inventing and elaborating analogies, invoking authorities, working through examples, marshaling one's tropes, and so on and on and on and on. What matters is that the writing knits together a persuasive, intriguing, coherent, presumably enlightening tale. Does the ethnography hold together? Do the empirical materials and analytic storyline fit? The nature of ethnographic evidence, interpretation, authority, and style may have changed, more modestly than I think radically, but the appeal of any single work remains tied to the specific arguments made within a specific text and reference to particular, not general, substantive, methodological, narrative matters. The point here is that we can now assert the textuality of ethnographic facts and the factuality of ethnographic texts at the same time. The two lay in quite different domains, and hence the work of ethnography goes on in much the same way as it did before textuality came into vogue. Because evidence, including the eyewitnessing, must still be offered to support a claim that in such a way, at least some readers are convinced that the author has something worth saying. Changes in attitude, changes in reader response are of course possible. What is persuasive to one generation of ethnographers may look ludicrous to the next. And every generation has some stake in showing predecessors to be airheads. But the paradoxical characterization of the textuality and the factuality of ethnography vanishes with the realization that ethnography is continually carried on by successive generations, doesn't remain the same because its facts, methods, theories, genres remain the same, but because in the midst of these changes, the audience still looks to it for the performance of a given task. In the end, it's the ethnographer's ability to deliver verisimilitude, to persuade, convince readers that what they're reading is an authentic tale, written by someone deeply familiar, knowledgeable about how things work, and are done in some particular place by some particular people at some particular time. Everything else that ethnography tries to do, to edify, to amuse, to challenge, to annoy, to startle, to theorize, to critique, rests on this. My unexpected journey started in 1965. I came to the then notably isolated, treeless, bare campus still under construction of the University of California, Irvine. A political science grad from Long Beach State, I came as a 22-year-old, relatively unimagined, uninspired student, ostensibly out to sort out various inchoate career possibilities to avoid the draft and perhaps hang out at the beach. Worth noting is that I never applied to this school. In fact, I never applied to graduate school, including UCI. Wondering what I would do in the fall, I just more or less wandered onto campus one day during the late summer, and by chance met with some people who happened to be around, available, willing to spend a little time with me. Fortunately, among those whom I met was the young dean of the social science department, Jim March. We had what I would recall as a pleasant informal chat, and miraculously I was told that very day I could be admitted as a designated special student to the small social science program designed by and large by Jim. Provisions were attached, of course. I had to send my undergraduate records on. I had to take the GREs in October. Left unsaid, I had to pass whatever classes I was taking the coming fall. All very casual, informal, impossible to imagine today. Little did I know at the time that this was a daring one-off educational program without a history or disciplinary boundaries. The first year got me reading, taught me some basic probability and statistics, left me slightly computer literate. The following year, the Graduate School of Administration opened, initiated a master's degree program. 5 students enrolled, myself included. 5 managed to graduate 2 years later. 4 went on to useful public and private management careers, and I figured I'd stick around once again and try a new program, this time the PhD program. Needless to say, this was transformational, highly consequential choice, for the program, as I experienced it as a cohort of 1, was nothing less than a free fall into an esoteric scholarly world that changed my vocation and way of life. And let me pause and use this as an occasion of serendipity and good fortune, as an example of the role that luck, chance plays in life. It plays, I would argue, a far, far greater role than most people recognize. Had I come a day late or an hour earlier, I might not have met with Jim March. Or had the university been more advanced in its bureaucratic procedures, I never would have been admitted. The roll of the dice certainly turned up in my favor. But I realize that most people don't like to hear of success, especially their own, explained away as luck. There's a strong hindsight bias to think after the fact that an event, in this case my career, was predictable when it wasn't. There are no counterfactuals to tell us what would have happened had I not been so lucky at various points in my career. Of course, most of us are vividly aware of how hard we work and the difficult problems we face, but our day-to-day environment provides few reminders of how fortunate we are to have not been born in the South Bronx or some remote Appalachian hollow. Or to put it in far more prosaic and personal terms, how fortunate we were to having met up with, say, an exceptional teacher, an influential coach, a close friend, steering us in what turned out to be the right direction. Our personal career narratives are biased another way as well. Events that work to our disadvantage are rather easier to recall than those that affect us in a positive way. A runner's sense of headwinds and tailwinds is relevant and helpful here. We're acutely aware and struggle against the headwinds, but when the winds are at our back, we're largely unaware, being pushed along by invisible and unheeded forces. If I were more conscious of the tailwinds at my back, such awareness would bring to light that throughout my career I've been endowed with an advantageous, favored demographic profile, blessed with privileged institutional position that featured light teaching loads, enormous intellectual help from patient colleagues who were and are supportive of my work, small classes, superb graduate students full of energy, talent, enthusiasm, curiosity, generous leave policies, relatively easy access to grants and fellowships that allowed me to pursue my research interests wherever they may lead, even if straight into a writer's block. These are indulgences, tailwinds that push me onward. Had I been at another institution, or maybe even at MIT some 10 or 20 years later, there might have been more pressure to cut to the chase, submit to the sort of social science and normal science dictates, and the increasingly narrow and intimidating publish or perish disciplinary pursuits that are today so common. If so, I might have done different work. These intergenerational and institutional differences are real, And I recognize that my career, like all careers, developed in a rather specific time and place, that advantages that were and are, sadly, hardly widespread. The biases that I've highlighted here all work to overestimate the role, one's own role, in whatever success we achieve, including ethnographic success. Most personal histories of the sort I'm displaying here almost certainly exaggerate the causal significance of the individual. True, overlooking the part that chance or luck plays in life may be perversely adaptive, encouraging us to work hard, carry on, fight in the face of challenge. But turning a blind eye to the role chance plays serves also to make personal narratives of success highly unreliable. Success stories based on an N of one, there's something of an exercise in fiction and imagination. History doesn't run controlled experiments. Personal histories retrospectively link rather vague and uncertain intentions to specified and realized outcomes, where in between the two were hundreds, maybe thousands, of unrecognized contingencies at play. Now, with this display of requisite modesty and humility on the record, and ruefully acknowledging that authenticity and sincerity are largely matters of being taken in by one's own act, I would be remiss were I not to mention the work that goes into research careers, and paradoxically, the effort we put into hiding such work. Among many others, I hold that success is largely a matter of grit, following a rule that says becoming proficient at anything takes dedication and practice, be it the arcane arts of archery, surgery, or ethnography. Yet invariably, we seem to chalk up success in others to talent. Some have it, some don't. Cognitive bias here says that natural talent, in the end, trumps effort and hard work. One function of such a bias, however, is to avoid ever having to say, in the presence of accomplished practitioners, there but for the grace of grit, go I. The partiality that is displayed for natural talent encourages many of us to cover up the laborious, time-consuming, potentially embarrassing efforts we put at getting good at what we do. For example, I have something of a deep terror of everyone ever seeing my half-written, grammatically flawed, poorly spelled, naively reasoned, cringeworthy drafts of papers of mine, perpetuating the myth that I'm a natural at what I do. The rightful words, folks, just come out. They fly out fast as I can type. Ha. The truth of the matter is that they come fitfully, woodenly, thus obscuring the amount of failure that goes into success. Such predilections make for confusing career advice. Try hard enough and you can do anything, but be sure to not let anyone know that you're trying so bloody hard. And so, we slog along, writing and revising endlessly, buoyed on by supportive commentary, yet taken back by harsh criticism. I've certainly had my share of rejections, but was always encouraged by my family, my friends, colleagues. Keep at it, keep going, keep making corrections and improvements where I could, but not grow disheartened and dejected as a result. I think that sometimes 80 or 90% of what I write is junk. And I've spent a hell of a lot of time in that 80 and 90%. I once had a senior faculty member advise me long, long ago that I should write less and concentrate on writing something really good. Sure. I realized then and now that I couldn't do that deliberately. Maybe the 10 or 20% that turns out well probably rests on learning something from the 80 or 90% that's bad. All writing is rewriting and sticking to it, and a little luck in attracting readers make all the difference in the world. The last page. With these habits of the heart and mind touched upon, let me, as a way of closing, remind you, dear assembled fellow field workers, that a good part of what I said is based on the murky but optimistic premise that there is a structure to our world, or to be more specific, a structure to the work we do in the occupational, organizational, institutional order in which it takes place. Moreover, the concepts we develop to decode this order promise to bring forth understandings that will actually help us act wisely, kindly, knowledgeably, strategically, productively in this, the one life we have to live. But remember, too, that what the disarming but playful ghost of Irving Goffman might say, that when all is said and done, we're all properly admonished as the infinite complexity of our social world and the ever-changing workings, the precepts, the assurances, the sturdy practices of our intellectual fields appear rather fragile, appear rather weak, and thus we must always return to the flickering, messy, cross-purpose, unknown, unknowable surroundings and circumstances that our empirical and analytic work seeks to tame. Words and the concepts they carry will hardly hold back the wind. But we continue, as I will, to try. Thank you.